Thank you so much. First, I would like to express my gratitude for letting me know about this conference to Michael Stermiska, who has actually summarized that throughout history, the Baltic peoples have struggled for self-preservation against external threats from colonizing German crusaders to Tsarist, Nazi and Soviet domination. Each Baltic people has its own memories of invasion, occupation and oppression, and lessons learned about the necessity of maintaining cultural traditions against the twin threat of extinction and assimilation. Here on the map is the Baltic cultural sphere filled in red, known as the last pagans of Europe, which includes the present-day Latvia. That is the geographical extent of this study. Other areas show the spheres of influence of Catholic and Orthodox Church during the Great Schism and territories of Viking dominance and Mongol Empire at their respective peak extent. So, for disclaimer, I'd like to clarify the definition of religious persecution, which is any hardship, physical abuse, and martyrdom endured due to one's religious affiliation within a broad spectrum of physically, psychologically, or socially and politically hostile unjust actions, such as torture, isolation, imprisonment, ostracism, restriction, or discrimination, resulting in varying levels of harm as it is considered from the victim's perspective. So the focus group of the study is Dievturi, and Dievturi is the folklore-based religion of Latvian life wisdom, which is Panenkatendeism, an up-to-date continuation of the primeval autochthonous religion, fostering the spiritual core of Latvianness. Dievturi are fellows of Dievturi, but have called so since 1925. So, in 2025, the centenary of its name in print is to be celebrated. Although the colonial history of religion and religious persecution in Latvia dates back to the 12th century, crusades, the aim of this research is to study cases of persecution of Dievturi from Latvia during the three periods. So it is the first independence, occupation, and contemporary challenges between 1925 and 2022. So this study stems from the doctoral thesis in theory of culture defended last December. Its summary is accessible on the research gate via the QR code titled Latvian Dievturi and the Japanese Shinto, a comparative study of rituals, their sacred space and texts. Once upon the initial registration of the first Dievturi kindred, the first case of religious persecution took place when the application by Ernsts Brastinš and Kārlis Bregžis, who co-authored the first book on Dievturi, met the resistance from the Faculty of Theology of the University of Latvia in its judgment on May 18, 1926, written by Dean Kārlis Kundziņš and Secretary Valdemārs Maldonis on the right side of the screen, stating that they are comprehensible both in terms of language and contents. Therefore, the appeal for registration is to be rejected. Also, in fact, one must admit that in Latvia, as a civilized country, a sect the aim of which is the revival of forefathers' idolatrous cult of gods cannot be permitted. However, despite the restrictions, still the Latvia Dievturi Draudze got registered at the Department of the Spiritual Affairs. Henceforth, it will be called the DSA of the Ministry of the Interior on July 26, 1926, and got upgraded as the Latvias Dievturi Sadraudze on October 7, 1929, as the registered religious union still intact and representing Dievturi in Latvia today. So, next, the induction of the first Dievturi celebrant in May 1928 got attention. Girts Austrums had just completed the studies at the Institute of Theology led by Latvian Bishop Kārlis Irbe, but could not take an oath to the evangelical Lutheran dogmas. When Dievturi established, Irbe did not take it seriously. Yet when a student of his Institute of Theology moved to Dievturi, perhaps the matter became serious for him. Namely, the Swedish Bishop Nathan Söderblom subpoenaed Irbe to explain the crossing of an institute student to a pagan faith. It caused stark controversy. Since Carlos Ulmanis established authoritarian regime in 1934, rapid economic growth took place, whereas Dievturi activities got oppressed. First, the law on religious congregations and their unions, issued on December 20th, 1934, demanded the re-registration of such. The DSA, led by Fricis Milenpaks, refused the registration to the Latvia's Dievturi Sadraudze in Riga, while the most congregations and unions of allochthonous religions had got registered on June 22, 1935. It was the result of a judgment of the Faculty of Theology of May 11, 1935, that advised and was later adopted by the DSA not to recognize the Latvia's Dievturi Sadraudze as a religious union, arguing that there is no categorical basic teaching, it lacks fundamental numinous sphere, and hence is a naive, eclectic construction without deeper contents or primary dynamics of religious experience. It focuses on cult time and outward ceremonies that obtain the nature of an aesthetically oriented staging. Nationalism of Dievturi does not fit to the needs of contemporary Latvia nor its future mission. Furthermore, the religious primitivism of Dievturi shall not satisfy the present human in his religious inclinations and needs. Therefore, on May 22nd, the DSA, quoting the aforementioned, declared to the Interior Minister that Dievturi are not to be registered at the DSA as a religious union, but at the Department of Press and Societies as a society that collects and studies ancient Latvian folklore. Because of this, Dievturi status was forcibly downgraded to a secular organization. Moreover, on December 5, 1935, the DSA declared it objects that the Latviju Dievturu Biedrība, as a secular organization, has also incorporated the religious topics in its program Course of Ancestral Virtues. As far as the secular part of the program, the DSA has no objections. Meanwhile, on August 12, the DSA declared, as the Vidvudu draugu nor has it registered at the district court, it is terminable by liquidation. Moreover, in October 1936 and 1937, the DSA reiterated that it objects that patriotic cultural performances by the secular society Dievturi Sadraudze are called sacred mornings, as the term contains a specific religious content and hence appropriates religious nature to a secular society, thus causing misunderstanding. To make things worse, since the conviction of leader Gustavs Celmiņš and the ban of his pērkonkrus, the far-right group that had plotted the assassination of Ulmanis, in 1935 some members decided to continue their activities under the cover of Dievturi kindreds, holding meetings at a Bai room of the Dievturi place of worship, thus further subjecting also Dievturi to the surveillance by the political directorate agents. In fact, some Dievturi had also joined pērkonkrus after May 1935, when the authoritarian regime began and became restrictive towards Dievturi itself. In October 1936, after the arrest and search of several Dievturi, Ernest Brastinš advised the co-members of pērkonkrus, the ex-convicts who had been detained in spring, to avoid attending Dievturi sacred mornings and singing in their choir. Next, the adoption of civil law in 1938 established the discrimination of Dievturi religious freedom of being married by the celebrant with legal consequences, as is the case of ministers of autochthonous religions, of all allophones religions, so those who are from foreign origin. I would like to stress that this restriction is still intact in Latvia. The Nazi-Soviet Pact of the next year initiated the occupation that lasted from 1940 to 1990. The half-century-long Soviet occupation resulted in a large Dievturi exile community abroad, while stark oppression and all-embracing censorship of Dievturi took place throughout the period of Soviet Latvia. Here is a fraction of Dievturi authors and Dievturi supporting authors which works were prohibited. Interestingly, some of them had been banned also during 4-year interim period of Nazi occupation. Moreover, 24 Dievturi martyrs massacred by communists still rest in unknown place. Please see the cenotaph erected in 2001 in Jāņus cemetery. Let me provide 3 examples of Dievturi victims of Soviet persecution. So the first, one of the organizers of Dievturība, artist, folklore and Hilford scholar Ernest Brastinch got arrested on July 6, 1940, sentenced to 8 years in prison on May 24, 1941, subject to Article 58.4 of Soviet Russia Penal Code, which is for any kind of help to international bourgeoisie, which, not recognizing the equality of communist political system, strives to overthrow it. He was executed by shooting on January 28, 1942 in Astrakhan without a trial. Rehabilitated on February 12, 2009. Second, poet Gunnar Streimanis got sentenced to 10 years in prison in Kolyma and Yakutia for anti-Soviet propaganda, sentenced to 5 years in Mordovia for composing anti-Soviet poems, sentenced to 4 years for anti-Soviet activity, poem and prose composition. I would like to stress that he spent 17 of 66 years of his life in Soviet reformative work camps. And third, independence activist Ints Zālītis was sentenced to 25 years in prison in Kolyma and Sevastopol, sentenced to 6 years in Mordovia for anti-Soviet agitation, then sentenced to 6 more years, thus spending 17 years of his life in Soviet gulags. The arrest in 1983 was a part of a crackdown on Dievturi, but the Soviet authorities viewed the interest in folklore and ancient traditions as a cloak for nationalist and anti-Soviet sympathies, and accused of Nazi activities similarly to the stance propagated by irredentist Russian media towards Ukraine and other its neighboring countries today. So, to summarize the Soviet period, historian Monty Sounds concludes that in the absence of the possibility of forming an organizational structure during the occupation in Latvia, nevertheless Dievturība existed as a network of people close to Dievturi or the spirit of Dievturība. As soon as the opportunity arose, the Dievturi Sadraudze resumed its activities, so the connection between 1940 and 1988 had not been broken. In 1989, the periodical Dievturi Vēstnesis resumed publishing and distributing as a samizdat, so underground publishing. As soon after the Latvijas Dievturi Sadraudze resurfaced by registration on April 18, 1990, receiving the renewed certificate on March 28, 1991. So this leads us to the third period developed since 1991. In the first decade, the Dievturi, being determined for the restoration of independence, they got opportunities to represent their contents in traditional culture and education. However, soon the circumstances changed as the radio program Dieva Padoms, aired for 4 years on the state media, met its abrupt closure in 1998. 2 years later, a treaty with the Holy See entered into force in Latvia, making the state to ensure the maintenance and protection of Catholic churches. Whereas the Constitutional Court rejected the Dievturi complaint about the restricted rights to teach religion in school. In 2008, newly introduced laws of several autonomous religious unions secured both immunity for interrogation and disclosure of information, even if the clergy is a witness or a party to their proceedings, and granted asylum for persecution from persecution for one's religious beliefs. Interesting case happened on December solstice in 2009, when a Christian congregation, New Generation or Jaunā paudze in Latvian, in Riga gathering about 100 people led by preacher Aleksej Leģeja, destroyed so-called books connected with occultism, magic and witchcraft, which were actually folk epic large places, collections of folk songs, folk tales, the Mārtiņa dziesmu grāmata containing the Latviju dainas, which are the sacred scriptures of Dievturi, and the works of Dievturi composers such as Jānis Norvilis, Raimonds Pauls, Jēkabs Grauviņš, and others. The event was promoted on the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Latvia website, and unexpected pamphlets distributed to mailboxes. Among the organizers, there was a preacher, Eva Ālere, who had continued hate speech towards Dievturi on video series Atver Acis, Open Your Eyes, and the Latvian Christian radio programs. In the new inner design of the passport of the Republic of Latvia, adopted in 2015 by Delotis, so the priest, from the Līgo flag of the song celebration of Latvians, also Lielvā the belt and other images with Latvian signs infuriated Christians as Dievturi content. For the purpose of correcting the discriminatory regulation, which are intact on April the 1st, 2021, the Latvijas Dievturi Sadrauds submitted to the Parliament Commission's proposals for amendments to the law on holidays, remembrance and celebrations, the civil law, and the law on religious organizations. The last of them, the amendment on the law on religious organizations, was refused on March 24th. Proposals have been resubmitted in June 2022. The last interesting case I would like to tell about is about the broadcast of the religious service. So as the editorial independence of state television LTV is ensured by the agreed and approved schedule of the Ecumenical Media Council Foundation, founded by representatives of one religion, namely Christianity, and the call of the Ministry of Justice for Public Service Media during lockdown is not binding, thus the broadcast time for the LTV cannot be planned at the request of third parties, is what they have been used for their excuse. So in order to allow the remote experience during the lockdown, the celebration of Mārtiņa got aired on November 7th, 2021 on 16 o'clock, both on regional television and radio Merkurs, becoming the first state-paid worship service in the media at a time when, until the centenary of the name of Dievturi, but there are less than 1,500 days left.
Uģis,
so,
just...
Thank you. Please feel free to ask your questions and follow Dievturi on social media.